These 9 tricks come straight from Amish gardeners. No rooting hormone, no fancy gadgets, no plastic bottles from the store. And July actually makes them work even better because the heat and humidity right now speed up rooting faster than almost any other time of year. 1. Willow water instead of store-bought rooting hormone. Long before rooting hormone existed in a plastic bottle, Amish growers used something already growing in their own backyard: willow bark. Willow naturally contains compounds called auxins and salicylic acid, which are the same types of substances that commercial rooting hormones are built around. In other words, the modern product on the store shelf is really just a concentrated, synthetic version of what's already inside a willow branch. To make willow water, chop a handful of fresh young willow branches into small pieces, about an inch long, and soak them in a jar of room temperature water for 24 hours. The water will turn slightly amber as the compounds release. Once it's ready, you can use it 2 ways. Soak your cuttings in it for a few hours before planting, or simply water your newly planted cuttings with it instead of plain water for the first couple of weeks. This method isn't limited to just one type of plant either. Amish gardeners traditionally used willow water across vegetables, roses, berry bushes, and ornamental shrubs alike, since the rooting compounds work on a wide range of plant tissue. It costs nothing, and if you have access to a willow tree nearby, whether it's a weeping willow, a pussy willow, or even a wild willow growing near a creek, you may never need to buy rooting hormone again. 2. Honey as a natural antibacterial sealant. Before synthetic sealants and powders existed, Amish gardeners relied on raw honey to protect a fresh cut. Honey has natural antibacterial and antifungal properties due to its low moisture content and natural acidity, which means it protects the wound on a cutting while the plant works on developing roots underneath. This matters most in the first 24 to 48 hours, when a fresh cut is most vulnerable to bacteria and fungus entering the plant tissue through the exposed wound. To use it, simply dip the freshly cut end into a small amount of raw, unprocessed honey. Not the pasteurized kind from a squeeze bottle, which has lost much of its natural enzyme activity through heat processing, and place it directly into soil or water. Some growers even mix a small amount of honey into water to create a diluted honey soak for multiple cuttings at once, which makes the process faster when propagating in bulk. This single, simple step prevents a lot of the early rot that quietly kills cuttings before they even get the chance to root. And it's often the missing piece for people who feel like their cuttings just die for no reason. 3. Morning-only cutting for July heat. One of the strictest rules in traditional Amish gardening is timing, and it's a rule most modern gardeners simply never learned, mostly because it isn't mentioned on plant tags or in typical gardening guides. Cuttings are never taken in the afternoon sun. In July's heat especially, a plant cut in the middle of the day is already stressed and partially dehydrated from hours of sun exposure, which makes successful rooting far less likely no matter what you do afterward, even if you follow every other step perfectly. Instead, cuttings are taken early in the morning, right after the coolest part of the night, when the plant is fully hydrated and its cells are turgid, meaning full of water and firm to the touch. A cutting taken at 7 a.m. from a well-watered plant will almost always outperform an identical cutting taken at 2 p.m. from the same plant, even though they came from the exact same source. This one habit alone, timing, can be the difference between a cutting that roots easily within 2 weeks and one that wilts and dies within hours of being cut, regardless of how good your soil or watering routine is afterward. 4. Mason jar humidity domes. Instead of using a plastic bag, which traps heat dangerously during summer and can effectively cook a cutting in direct sun within a single afternoon, Amish growers often place an upturned mason jar over a freshly planted cutting. This creates a simple, small greenhouse effect. Humidity stays trapped around the cutting, keeping the leaves from losing moisture faster than the roots can replace it. But the glass doesn't overheat the way plastic does when July sun hits it directly. It's a small trick, but it solves one of the most common summer rooting failures: cuttings that dry out and shrivel before roots ever form. For larger cuttings, some growers use a wide-mouth glass jar or even an inverted glass bowl instead of a small mason jar. The key detail many people miss is ventilation. Lifting the jar for a few minutes each day prevents excess condensation and mold buildup inside the dome, which can be just as damaging as letting the cutting dry out completely. 5. Clay pot bottom watering. Traditional Amish gardens rely heavily on unglazed clay pots rather than plastic ones. And this isn't just an aesthetic choice. It's a functional one rooted in how moisture actually behaves in different materials. The porous walls of a clay pot allow excess moisture to evaporate naturally through the sides, which means the soil around your cutting doesn't stay soggy the way it would in a sealed plastic container. This matters even more in July, when humidity is already high in the air and soggy soil quickly leads to root rot before roots even have a chance to establish themselves. Bottom watering reinforces this effect even further. Instead of pouring water directly onto the soil surface, which can disturb a fragile, unrooted cutting, the pot is placed in a shallow dish of water and allowed to soak upward through the drainage hole. This keeps the topsoil from staying oversaturated while still delivering consistent moisture to the root zone, giving your cutting the balance it needs without drowning it or leaving it bone dry between waterings. 6. Node placement below the soil line. This is a simple rule that gets skipped constantly, even by experienced gardeners who've been propagating plants for years without ever being told this specific detail. Every cutting has small bumps or slight swellings along the stem called nodes, and this is specifically where new roots emerge from, not just anywhere along the stem, which is a common misunderstanding. If you plant a cutting without at least one node positioned below the soil line, it may sit there for weeks, appearing green and healthy on the surface, without ever actually rooting. No matter how well you follow every other step in this list. Amish growers are notably strict about this detail, checking each cutting individually before planting to make sure at least one node, and ideally two, sit beneath the soil surface. For longer cuttings, this often means burying 2 to 3 inches of stem, rather than the shallow half-inch many people default to out of habit or uncertainty about how deep is too deep. 7. Chamomile tea rinse for damping off prevention. Damping off is a fungal disease that causes the base of a cutting or seedling to turn soft, brown, and mushy, and it spikes dramatically in warm, humid conditions, exactly the environment July creates in most climates across the country. Long before commercial fungicides were common or affordable for the average household, Amish gardeners used a cooled chamomile tea rinse on both the cutting itself and the surrounding soil as a preventative measure. Chamomile contains natural antifungal compounds, and a light rinse applied once or twice a week can prevent the soft stem rot that quietly kills many cuttings during the hottest, most humid weeks of summer, often before the gardener even notices anything is wrong. To make it, simply steep a chamomile tea bag in hot water, let it cool completely to room temperature so it doesn't shock the roots, and use it in place of a regular watering for that week. 8. Consistent afternoon shade. Direct July sunlight can be intense enough to cook a fresh, unrooted cutting before it ever gets the chance to establish itself, since a cutting without roots has no way to pull up extra water from the soil to compensate for heat stress the way an established plant can. Rather than placing cuttings in full, all-day sun, traditional Amish garden beds are often positioned near the east side of a building or barn, or beneath light, dappled tree cover, so cuttings receive gentle morning light but are naturally shaded once the harsher afternoon sun arrives around midday. This balance, light without prolonged heat stress, is one of the most overlooked reasons some cuttings root easily during summer, while others placed in a sunnier, more exposed spot simply shrivel and fail within just a few days, leaving many gardeners confused about what went wrong. 9. Weekly tug test instead of guessing. The last trick isn't a product or a mixture at all. It's patience, and it's arguably the hardest one for most people to actually follow through on. Many gardeners accidentally disturb their cuttings by checking on them daily, moving them around to inspect the base, or even gently pulling them upward to see if roots have formed, which can easily damage delicate new root growth before it has a real chance to strengthen and anchor itself. Instead, Amish growers use a simple weekly tug test. Once a week, very gently tug upward on the cutting. If you feel resistance, that means roots have begun anchoring it into the soil below. If it lifts easily with no resistance at all, it simply needs more time, and disturbing it further will only set the entire process back by days or even weeks. This slower, calmer approach to monitoring progress is often the real, underrated difference between a cutting that survives and thrives and one that quietly fails without anyone understanding why. None of these tricks require anything expensive, and none of them are new inventions dressed up as old wisdom for the sake of a good story. They're simply methods that worked reliably long before rooting powders, humidity tents, and greenhouse kits existed. And in July's heat, and humidity specifically, sometimes those older, simpler methods still outperform anything you can buy at a garden center.